Pick up a cold orange Fanta, and the whole thing feels designed to make you feel good. Bright color, sweet smell, that fizz hitting the back of your throat on a hot day. The marketing has always sold it as pure summer, young, carefree, completely uncomplicated. The actual origin is about as far from that image as you can possibly get. This is a story about a drink that arguably should never have existed. It was born in the wrong place, at the wrong time, for entirely the wrong reasons. And for decades, the company that owns it preferred you didn't think too hard about any of that. To understand how Fanta happened, you have to understand Max Keith first. Without Keith, there is no story. By the mid-1930s, Keith was running Coca-Cola's German operation. He was German-born, ambitious, and utterly focused on growth. He took charge of a market where soft drinks were an afterthought. Beer was the national religion, and sugary, carbonated drinks were seen as something for children, not for serious adults. Keith changed that through aggressive sales tactics and a willingness to plug Coca-Cola into the new political reality of Germany. He understood something important about the moment he was operating in. Germany in the 1930s was not a normal country anymore, organizing itself around a single ideology, and every institution, sport, culture, industry, entertainment was being pulled into that project. Keith saw no reason why Coca-Cola should be any different. If the Nazi Party was going to be woven into every aspect of German life, then Coca-Cola was going to be woven right in alongside it. Coke began appearing everywhere the regime wanted to show itself off. At major exhibitions celebrating National Socialist achievement, Coca-Cola didn't just buy ad space. It built miniature bottling plants in the middle of the fairgrounds, with little trains running through them for children. Right next to official propaganda displays, company advertising showed happy German workers and families drinking Coke under swastikas and eagles, presenting the drink as part of the modern, confident, new Germany. Then came the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Hitler and his circle designed those games as a global showcase, proof that National Socialist Germany was modern, powerful, and here to stay. Coca-Cola was a key sponsor. Coke was supplied to athletes and visitors throughout the games, while Coca-Cola banners flew alongside Nazi symbols across the venues. Robert Woodruff, the head of Coca-Cola in Atlanta, attended in person. In the stadiums, the red and white Coca-Cola branding and the red, white, black flags of the Third Reich looked disturbingly comfortable next to each other. By 1939, Germany was drinking millions of cases of Coca-Cola a year. Keith had pulled off something remarkable. Business was booming. And then the whole thing started to fall apart. It started with a bottle cap. In the late 1930s, a rival German soda company, Afri-Cola, led by Karl Flock, noticed something on Coca-Cola bottles in the United States. Hebrew lettering on the caps, indicating kosher certification for Jewish consumers. Flock turned this detail into a weapon. In Nazi Germany, where anti-Semitic conspiracy theories were official policy, he spread the idea that Coca-Cola was a Jewish drink, secretly controlled by Jews. In that environment, this wasn't a small accusation. It was potentially lethal for the brand. Party offices and Nazi organizations began to distance themselves, and Coke's carefully cultivated reputation was at real risk. Sales took a serious hit, and Keith had to move fast. His response tells you a lot about both the man and the world he was operating in. He didn't publicly challenge the anti-Semitism behind the smear. He didn't defend Coke's integrity in moral terms. Instead, he doubled down on proving that Coca-Cola belonged inside the Nazi project. He poured advertising and sponsorship into patriotic events, rallies, and youth activities. Coke became even more visible at Hitler Youth gatherings, factory celebrations, and party-approved festivities, the drink of the ordinary German under National Socialism. It worked. The rumor faded. The company recovered and kept growing. But Keith had saved his business by binding it even more tightly to a regime whose actions were clearly getting darker. Whether that bothered him privately, we don't know. What we do know is that the bargain he'd made was about to get far more complicated. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and Europe slid into war. For a time, Coca-Cola in Germany kept going. Shipments of the secret Coke syrup from Atlanta, the closely guarded 7X flavoring formula, still trickled in, despite growing disruptions. Germany kept drinking Coke even as it became an enemy of the United States in all but name. Then came December 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States formally entered the war. America and Germany were now official enemies, and trade between them was effectively shut down under existing and newly enforced trading with the enemy rules. The supply of genuine Coca-Cola syrup to Germany dried up. Whatever was already in country was all Keith had left. He had seen this coming. As the war widened and the British naval blockade tightened, Keith started thinking about what would happen if Coke syrup stopped arriving altogether. He knew what the Nazi state did to businesses that suddenly had nothing to produce. The regime didn't wait politely. It seized factories, repurposed them for war production, and sent workers to the front or to other plants. Keith wasn't going to let that happen to his bottling plants or his workforce. So he came up with a plan. If they couldn't bottle Coca-Cola, they'd bottle something else. Keith called his chemists together and gave them a nearly impossible brief. Create a new soft drink using only ingredients available inside a heavily rationed, war economy Germany. No imported citrus. No high-quality sweeteners. No access to the secret Coke formula. Most good ingredients had already been diverted to the military. What they had was whatever the food industry didn't want. They turned to whey, the thin, yellowish liquid left over from cheese production, which dairies often treated as waste. They added apple pomace, the mashed skins, cores, and pulp squeezed out of apples at cider presses, basically the leftovers of leftovers. For sweetness, they used beet sugar when they could get it, or saccharin when they couldn't. The exact proportions shifted constantly depending on what rationing allowed in any given week. Because of those changing supplies, the taste of this new drink wasn't consistent. Fanta in the summer of 1942 didn't taste exactly like Fanta in the winter of 1943. The recipe moved with the seasons and with the scraps available. The result looked nothing like the bright orange soda you know today. Accounts describe it as a cloudy, yellow-brownish drink. Not vivid, not cheerful. It was vaguely sweet, faintly fruity, and slightly sour from the whey. By normal standards, it was a drink assembled from the food industry's garbage. When the time came to name it, Keith told his team to use their imagination. One salesman, Joe Nip, didn't overthink it. He just said the first word that popped into his head: Fanta. It was short, easy to say, easy to print on a label. In the middle of the Second World War, inside a Nazi-controlled economy running on scraps, a name that would one day be recognized by billions was born in a few seconds. What happened next is strange and a little heartbreaking when you think about it. Fanta didn't become important simply because there were no alternatives. As the war dragged on, sugar effectively vanished from ordinary civilian life. German families lived on increasingly limited, monotonous rations: thin bread, ersatz coffee, small portions, very few treats. Anything sweet became rare. Fanta was one of the only sweet things that many people could still buy, so they started using it in ways nobody at Coca-Cola had planned. German housewives poured it into soups and stews to bulk up calories and add a hint of sweetness to meals that had almost none. They splashed it into baking recipes when sugar simply wasn't available. It stopped being just a soft drink and became a cooking ingredient, a small mercy in a country where food joy had mostly disappeared. Meanwhile, Keith had to navigate a moral and political minefield. Many post-war accounts say he never joined the Nazi Party, despite repeated pressure, and resisted installing party loyalists in top positions at Coca-Cola Germany. At the same time, his company's success depended on staying in the regime's good graces, supplying drinks to factories, events, and the Wehrmacht. When the last reserves of genuine Coca-Cola syrup in Germany finally ran out, he faced an uncomfortable decision. Some sources suggest that what little syrup remained was reserved for military hospitals treating wounded soldiers, while civilians got only Fanta. Even in that detail, you can see the logic of survival under total war. Give the real stuff to the war effort. Give the ersatz drink to everyone else. By 1943, his plants were producing around 3 million cases of Fanta a year. The factories stayed open. The workers kept their jobs and draft exemptions. Every bottling line, every truck, every piece of Coca-Cola's infrastructure in Germany remained in German hands, ready for whatever came next. In purely business terms, Keith had achieved what he set out to do. In May 1945, Nazi Germany collapsed. Cities were smoking ruins. Millions were dead. The Third Reich was gone. Before anyone in Atlanta had fully grasped what had happened inside Germany during the war, he reached out to Coca-Cola headquarters. He offered to return everything: the plants, the trucks, the trademarks, and the profits made by selling Fanta while cut off from the United States. On paper, he could have tried to keep it all and run the company independently. In practice, he chose to tie Coca-Cola Germany back into the global corporation. Coca-Cola launched an investigation into his wartime conduct. They had to know whether they were bringing back a man who'd become a committed Nazi collaborator or someone who'd simply done what he had to do to keep the business alive. Accounts differ in the details, but the internal and external reviews ultimately concluded that Keith had not been a party member, had resisted direct political control inside the company, and had kept the German subsidiary intact so it could be reintegrated after the war. Coca-Cola reinstated him not just as head of the German branch, but eventually as head of European operations. He spent the rest of his career rebuilding Coca-Cola's presence across a continent trying to rebuild itself. As for Fanta, nobody in Atlanta was sentimental about it. The war was over. The syrup was flowing again. The original Fanta, that cloudy, whey-and-pomace drink, was quietly discontinued, and the brand shelved in Germany by around 1949. For a few years, it looked like the name would simply vanish. 10 years passed. The world changed. West Germany industrialized. Italy boomed. American-style consumer culture spread across Europe, and Pepsi started winning. In the early 1950s, Pepsi began pushing cola and fruit-flavored drinks in European markets and started taking real shelf space away from Coca-Cola. Coke needed a counterattack. Something fruity, something not cola, something that could live next to their flagship product rather than competing. Someone at Coca-Cola remembered a name that was just sitting there in the company's history. A name invented in wartime Germany by a salesman responding to a boss's offhand comment about imagination. Fanta. This time, they did everything differently. In 1955, at a Coca-Cola bottling plant in Naples, Italy, they developed a completely new drink, a bright, sweet, citrus-forward orange soda built on local Italian orange juice. No whey, no apple pomace, no murky brown color. Just a sunny, fruit-flavored soft drink that fit perfectly into the post-war European dream. The new Fanta Orange was an immediate success. It spread from Italy into other European countries, then into Latin America, Africa, and eventually the rest of the world. Coca-Cola's marketing machine covered the brand in bright colors, smiling faces, and endless summer imagery. The wartime origin story became a footnote, buried under decades of advertising featuring happy teenagers on beaches. Most people never even realized that Fanta had started life as Nazi Coke. There's an odd epilogue to all of this. In 2015, for Fanta's 75th anniversary in Germany, Coca-Cola Deutschland released a limited edition called Fanta Classic, marketed as inspired by the original 1940 recipe. The label explained that it contained around 30% whey product and fruit pomace and was less sweet, a nod to the wartime drink made from scraps. People bought it out of curiosity. By most accounts, it tasted exactly as strange as you'd expect a soda made from cheese byproducts and apple leftovers to taste. It didn't last long on the shelves, and then it was gone. The Fanta that exists today, the bright orange version sold in more than 190 countries, in over 100 flavors, shares almost nothing with that original German drink except the name. That name came from a single, quick moment in a German bottling plant in 1940, when a salesman heard his boss say, "Use your imagination," and shortened Fanta Z to something snappier. The can or bottle you're holding is the end product of one of the strangest chains of events in food history. A global depression, the rise of Nazism, corporate opportunism, anti-Semitic propaganda, a naval blockade, a trade embargo, wartime rationing, cheese factory waste, a 3-second naming brainstorm, post-war reconstruction, Pepsi's competition, and an Italian plant with access to good oranges. Every single one of those things had to line up for this drink to exist.